This memory comes back to me every winter, especially during the first heavy snow of the season. It was early December, the kind of cold that bites through layers of clothing, the sort that blankets everything in an eerie silence except for the crunch of boots on fresh snow. Usually, my family would spend these nights cozied up by the fire, watching old movies or sipping hot chocolate. But that year was different. My parents had to attend a last-minute work event, and instead of staying home, they left me at my uncle's cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The cabin was rustic, tucked between tall pines heavy with snow, and the nearest neighbor was a good half-hour drive away. I wasn't alone, though. Two of my closest friends, Mark and Lisa, came with me for the overnight stay. Mark had grown up in a nearby town and was no stranger to harsh winters, but he'd always told stories about people disappearing in these woods during blizzards, locals who'd vanished without explanation, swallowed by the cold. Lisa, on the other hand, was more skeptical. She liked to joke that Mark's stories were just campfire tales meant to scare kids. But even she couldn't deny the uneasy feeling that settled in the cabin that night. When we arrived, the sun was already low, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. The cabin's windows glowed warmly, but outside, the world looked frozen and quiet, like a painting untouched by life. We unpacked quickly, eager to explore before nightfall. Mark was the first to suggest we take a walk into the woods after dark. "It's not often we get snow this deep and fresh," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. "We should see it before it gets too late." I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. We were kids, really, no adults around except in the distant cabins, and the idea of wandering into the forest at night sent a chill through me that wasn't just from the cold. But Mark's confidence was contagious, and Lisa agreed, so off we went, each step crunching through the thick snow. The moon was rising, a pale orb casting a ghostly light that made the trees look like towering shadowy figures. At first, it was magical. Snowflakes drifted lazily down, and our laughter echoed softly between the trees. We pointed out animal tracks, rabbit, deer, maybe a fox, and tried to guess where the animals had gone. But after a while, the forest grew quieter, too quiet. The usual night sounds, the rustling of small animals, the distant calls of birds, were gone. Instead, all we could hear was the whisper of the wind, carrying with it strange, faint murmurs that seemed almost like voices, but impossible to understand. Mark stopped suddenly, holding up a gloved hand. "Do you see those?" he whispered, nodding toward the snow ahead. There were footprints, but they weren't human, or at least, not completely. They were too large and oddly shaped, with claw-like marks on the edges. They trailed deeper into the woods, leading away from any path we knew. Lisa shivered and pulled her jacket tighter. "Maybe it's just a weird animal," she said, trying to sound brave. But even she looked unsettled. The footprints seemed to move with purpose, and the whispers on the wind grew louder, like distant voices carried from far away. I wanted to turn back, to get inside where it was warm and safe, but something about the mystery pulled me forward. We followed the tracks for a short while, weaving between trees that looked ancient and gnarled under the weight of snow. The cold seemed to press in on us, and the air grew still, too still, like the forest was holding its breath. The whispers faded to silence, replaced by a heavy quiet that felt unnatural. I glanced back at Mark and Lisa, their faces pale in the moonlight, eyes wide with the same mix of fear and curiosity I felt. Eventually, the path opened up to a small clearing where the snow was untouched except for the strange footprints. We stood there, the three of us, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Mark broke the silence, his voice low. "We shouldn't be out here too long. The woods at night, it's different. Watchful." He looked around nervously, as if he half expected something to emerge from the shadows. Lisa nodded quickly. "Let's head back to the cabin. This place gives me the creeps." Relief flooded me at her words, and I was ready to follow, but then something caught my eye. A flicker of movement near the edge of the clearing, just a shadow, disappearing behind a tree. I blinked, and it was gone, but the feeling of being watched settled over me like a heavy blanket. We turned back, our footsteps hurried and uneven. The forest seemed to close in, the trees pressing closer together as if trying to keep us in. The whispers returned, softer now, almost like a sigh, and the wind seemed colder, sharper. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking just beyond the trees. By the time we reached the cabin, our cheeks were flushed from the cold, and our breaths came in ragged puffs. Inside, the warmth hit me like a wave, and I could finally relax. We shed our snow-covered coats and gathered around the fireplace, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the wooden walls. Mark was unusually quiet, staring into the fire with a distant look, while Lisa kept glancing toward the window, as if expecting to see the forest breathing just outside. Despite the comfort of the cabin, none of us spoke much about what we'd seen. The footprints, the whispers, the shadow, we all felt it was something we weren't meant to understand. Still, the night was far from over, and we knew the forest outside wasn't done with us yet. After a few minutes warming up by the fire, the three of us sat in a tense silence. The cabin felt safe compared to the shadows lurking in the woods, but the uneasy feeling from outside hadn't left me. Mark broke the silence with a low voice. "There's something out there. I don't think those footprints are from any animal we know." Lisa gave him a doubtful look but didn't argue. We all knew the forest could be strange in winter, but what we'd seen didn't make sense. The whispers we'd heard on the wind were still fresh in my mind, and the way the snow had seemed to hold its breath outside the clearing kept replaying in my thoughts. After a few more minutes, Mark stood up. "We need to check it out. Those noises, they weren't just the wind." Lisa hesitated but didn't stop him. I felt my heart pounding, but I couldn't let them go alone. I grabbed my coat and followed. The night was even colder now, the darkness thicker, as though the forest itself wanted to hide something. We stepped outside, the door closing behind us with a soft thud. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was still, unnervingly so. We moved cautiously, our flashlights barely cutting through the darkness, the beam shaking slightly as we walked deeper into the woods. The usual signs of forest life were gone. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving a silence that pressed against my ears. The snow around us was undisturbed except for the strange footprints we'd seen earlier. They led us further away from the cabin, twisting between the trees like a trail left by something that didn't want to be followed. We stopped when the footprints ended abruptly near a thicket of birch trees. The snow here was unnaturally still, like it had been frozen in time. Mark bent down and brushed some snow away, revealing faint scratches beneath. "These aren't claw marks," he whispered, "they're too precise, like carvings in the wood." Lisa shivered and looked around nervously. "Maybe we should go back," she said, but Mark was already moving forward. Then, from the shadows ahead, an old man appeared. He was dressed in worn winter clothes, a heavy coat patched and faded, boots caked with mud and snow. He pushed a small wooden sled covered by a tarp, the edges frayed and dirty. His face was weathered, with deep lines and pale eyes that seemed to hold stories older than the forest itself. The sudden presence startled us, and we instinctively stepped back. "Good evening," the man said softly, his voice rough but calm. "You kids shouldn't be wandering so far into the woods at night." There was something strange in his tone, not quite threatening, but not entirely friendly either. Mark stepped forward cautiously. "We heard noises," he said. "We saw footprints. Do you know what's out here?" The man nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the woods around us. "There are things in these forests older than any town or trail. Some better left alone." He moved the tarp on the sled slightly, revealing a glimpse of something under it. His eyes twinkled with a mix of pride and warning. "Come with me. I'll show you something amazing, but be warned, it's not for the faint of heart." Curiosity mixed with fear, but we followed him, stepping carefully through the snow toward a small shack hidden behind a thicket of pines. The wood was gray and weather-beaten, covered in frost, the door hanging slightly ajar. The man pushed it open and gestured for us to enter. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of damp earth and decay. The shack was cluttered with old tools, animal traps, and strange symbols carved into the walls. But what caught my attention was the sled. The tarp he'd pulled back earlier concealed several frozen shapes wrapped in cloth and ice. They looked like animal carcasses at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw twisted limbs, misshapen faces, something unnatural. Mark's face paled, and Lisa gasped. "What is that?" I whispered, stepping closer despite the chill that ran down my spine. The man's expression darkened. "They're not animals, not entirely. I collect them, creatures caught between the wild and something else. Frozen in time, preserved in winter's grip." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that made my skin crawl. Panic surged through me. This wasn't just some old man with strange habits, it felt like we'd stumbled into something ancient, something dangerous. I grabbed Mark's arm. We should get out of here. Lisa was already moving toward the door, her eyes wide with fear. The men didn't stop us. Go, but remember, some things in these woods don't like to be disturbed. You've seen too much already. His voice echoed in the cold air as we hurried out into the night. Once outside, the forest felt even darker, the shadows deeper as if the trees themselves were watching us flee. We didn't speak much on the way back, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The footprints, the whispers, the frozen creatures, it was all too much to process. The warmth of the cabin was a distant promise, but we didn't slow down until we were safely inside, the door locked behind us. Back by the fire, our earlier excitement had turned to a heavy silence. Mark stared into the flames, his jaw tight. Who was that man? How long has he been out there? Lisa shook her head, trying to shake off the chill that wasn't just from the cold. And what were those things? They weren't animals. Not really. I couldn't sleep that night, the images of frozen, twisted forms haunting my mind. The cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a fragile barrier between us and the unknown lurking just beyond the walls. The whispers in the wind seemed louder now, as if the forest was trying to remind us that some secrets were never meant to be uncovered. The next morning, the cold light filtering through the frost-covered windows did little to ease the weight pressing on my chest. Sleep had been elusive, my mind tangled in the images of the frozen figures and the strange man's warning. Mark and Lisa were quieter than usual, the night's events hanging heavily between us. We needed answers, but none of us knew where to turn. That afternoon, as the sun barely warmed the wintry woods, a local hunter named Tom arrived at the cabin. He was a tall, rugged man with a weather-beaten face and deep-set eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Mark had mentioned him once or twice before, saying he knew more about the forest than anyone else around. When Tom stepped inside, his gaze immediately locked onto the three of us, as if assessing whether we were trouble or in trouble. "You kids look like you've seen a ghost," Tom said, his voice gruff but not unkind. We told him about the men in the woods, the footprints, and the frozen figures in the shack. Tom listened carefully, nodding as we spoke, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "That man," Tom said slowly, "has been missing for years. Folks around here said he wandered into the forest one winter and never came back. Some believe he didn't survive the cold, others think something else claimed him." He paused, looking out the window toward the thick woods. "If you saw him alive, that's not a good sign." We exchanged uneasy glances. Mark's story suddenly felt far less like tall tales and more like warnings. Tom continued, "This forest has a history, disappearances, strange sounds, people getting lost and never found. The cold seems to hold on to those who don't leave in time." He shook his head. "That shack you described? It's been empty for years, or so we thought. If it's still standing, and if that man's still around, there's something not right." Tom's presence brought a strange mix of comfort and dread. He was a living connection to the forest's secrets, but his words confirmed our fears. That evening, after he left, my parents were contacted. They arranged for a search party to come out the next day, hoping to find any sign of the strange man or explain the footprints we'd followed. The woods felt different after that, heavier, as if watching us with unseen eyes. The search party scoured the area around the cabin and the shack, but found no trace of either the men or the eerie sled. The frozen creatures we'd glimpsed inside the shack were gone, as if they'd never existed. The footprints had vanished as well, leaving only smooth, untouched snow. The mystery deepened, and so did the strain between Mark and me. What we'd seen that night in the shack haunted us both, an unspoken fear that neither of us could shake. Our friendship, once easy and carefree, grew tense. Mark became distant, his usual confidence replaced by a quiet, brooding silence. I wanted to talk about it, to understand what we'd stumbled upon, but he shut me out, retreating into himself like the forest had claimed a piece of him. Months later, in the winter of 2018, the memory of that night still lingered. I found myself volunteering at the town's annual winter festival, a community event centered around a large bonfire in the town square. It was a night full of laughter, music, and the warm glow of flames cutting through the cold. For a few hours, it felt like the world was normal again, safe from the shadows that had haunted me. But as the night wore on, I noticed a figure standing just beyond the firelight's reach. Wrapped in a heavy parka, the person remained still, watching the crowd silently. Something about the way they lingered unsettled me. The figure didn't approach anyone, but their presence was impossible to ignore. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just someone seeking warmth or maybe someone feeling lonely. But when the figure began to move closer, attempting to start conversations in a broken, unfamiliar accent, my unease grew. Their words were disjointed, and their eyes darted nervously around the crowd. I edged closer to friends, hoping to stay safe in numbers. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I alerted a security guard nearby. The guard kept a discreet eye on the figure, who soon grew more erratic. At one point, the person tried to slip into the adjacent community hall through a side door, but was stopped before entering. When authorities were called, they searched the area, finding only footprints leading away into the dark streets. The figure had vanished. I stayed with friends until the festival ended, the warmth of the fire no longer comforting but a reminder of how close that shadow had come. The encounter left me wondering if the figure was connected to the strange men from the woods or if it was something new but equally unsettling. The forest's mysteries had followed me into town, refusing to be left behind. The figure's presence at the winter festival lingered in my mind long after the event ended. I kept replaying their strange behavior, the way they hovered on the edge of the crowd, speaking in broken words that felt almost rehearsed, their eyes darting anxiously as if searching for something or someone. It was unlike anything I'd ever encountered, and the unease it stirred refused to fade. I remember the moment the figure moved closer, stepping into the warmth of the bonfire's glow, attempting to start a conversation. Their accent was heavy and fractured, their phrases halting and disjointed. "Cold, night, need, help," they asked, voice barely above a whisper. Something about the way they spoke seemed off, as if they were trying to communicate but struggling to find the right words or maybe to connect with people who didn't understand their language, or their intent. I instinctively edged back towards the cluster of friends near the fire, the sense of isolation creeping over me. The figure's eyes locked onto mine briefly, and I swear I saw a flicker of desperation, or was it warning, before they looked away, focusing on someone else. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. I moved closer to a security guard stationed near the community hall, quietly explaining my concerns. The guard nodded, his gaze flicking toward the figure, who had by then begun pacing near the side entrance of the hall. The behavior was erratic, nervous, restless. At one point, the figure reached for the door handle, attempting to slip inside unnoticed. The guard intercepted them quickly, asking for identification, but the figure only muttered more broken words, their hands trembling. The guard's demeanor shifted from cautious to firm, and he radioed for backup. I watched, heart pounding, as the figure's agitation grew. They glanced around nervously, their breath coming in short gasps, and then, almost suddenly, they bolted from the door, disappearing into the snowy streets beyond the festival grounds. The police arrived within minutes, sweeping the area with flashlights and questioning bystanders. They found a trail of footprints leading away from the community hall, but the figure had vanished without a trace. The officers reassured us that they would increase patrols in the area, but no arrests or sightings followed. That night, I stayed with friends, unable to shake the feeling that something more sinister had brushed past us. The figure's broken words echoed in my mind, their desperate attempts to communicate, and the way they tried to enter a locked building without permission. It was as if they were searching for something hidden, something dangerous. I kept wondering if this was connected to the strange men in the woods or the frozen figures we had discovered years earlier. Was it the same darkness creeping into the town, or a new shadow entirely? The forest's mysteries, it seemed, were not confined to the wilderness. They followed, lurking just beyond the firelight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The memory of that night stayed with me, a chilling reminder that some things are best left in the dark, and some questions have no answers. A few weeks after the festival, I found myself at a holiday party hosted by Eric, a friend from school who seemed trustworthy. It was supposed to be a safe, fun night, just a group of us celebrating the season in a warm, cheerful home. The house was tucked away on a quiet street, decorated with twinkling lights and the scent of pine. Everything about the evening felt normal at first, but as the night wore on, a subtle unease began to creep in. Eric was unusually insistent on showing me something special, a secret basement room he claimed was filled with relics and old photographs. I was curious but hesitant. Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me, like he wanted to impress, or maybe intimidate. Still, I followed him down the narrow, creaky staircase, the light growing dimmer with each step. The basement was cluttered and dusty, walls lined with strange items that looked like they belonged in a museum of forgotten things. Old photographs of unknown people, faded and yellowed, were pinned haphazardly to the walls. There were odd trinkets, animal bones, rusty tools, and what looked like weathered masks made from bark or leather. The air was thick and stale, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked Eric what all this was about, but he just smiled, eyes glinting strangely. "These are pieces of history," he said softly. "Things that tell stories no one else remembers." His tone was almost reverent, but there was something dark beneath it, a shadow I couldn't ignore. As I looked around, a creeping feeling of dread settled over me. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to offend him. Then, just as I was about to suggest going back upstairs, we heard voices, neighbors talking outside, their tone urgent and worried. I could see shadows moving through the windows. Moments later, flashing lights appeared outside. The police had been alerted by neighbors who'd heard strange noises coming from the house. When they arrived, they found the place was scheduled for demolition and had been vacant for months. The whole scene didn't add up. How was Eric hosting a party in a house that wasn't supposed to be occupied? The officers questioned us, their faces grim and confused. I quickly realized the party wasn't safe, not because of Eric's guests, but because of Eric himself. After that night, I started receiving cryptic messages from him. Texts filled with strange symbols, references to dark winter secrets, and warnings to keep quiet. The messages felt like threats, though they were cloaked in riddles and half-truths. My friends and I shared everything with the police, hoping they could make sense of it. But the officers offered no clear answers, their reassurances hollow against the growing sense of unease. It felt like the darkness we'd encountered in the woods, the strange figure at the festival, and now this party were all connected somehow, threads woven into a cold, tangled web. That night, lying awake, I couldn't shake the feeling that the past was reaching out, dragging shadows from forgotten places into the present. The winter's chill wasn't just in the air, it was in the stories, the faces, the places no one dared to speak of. And I was caught in the middle, left wondering how deep the darkness really went.